Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm very happy to be here. I don't know if anyone attending is on the East Coast, but here in New York, we had some record-breaking heat this week and some power outages over the last couple of days. So just goes to show how important climate issues can really impact your day to day. So I'm very happy to be here, this webinar with you. This webinar is brought to you by both branches of SES, that's Global Services, and SES Consulting. Today, we're going to explore water in a global context. So, looking at the importance of effective management, we're going to look at establishing a baseline, achieving water stewardship certifications, and then we're going to finish with quality data for disclosure and reporting. We're also going to cover verification, emerging regulations, and any questions you have, you can pop those in the question box and we'll address them at the end. On that note, there's a couple housekeeping points we just want to point out on this webinar platform. Everyone who joins is going to be listen only, but again, the question feature is yours to use, so please feel free to put your questions in that chat and we'll discuss at the end of the webinar. Also, this is going to be recorded, so you're going to receive a link to the recording sometime next week. Okay, just a quick disclaimer. This webinar is for informational purposes only. It's not a substitute for legal or financial advice, nor is it meant to replace tailored research or consulting when it comes to your water stewardship decisions. To introductions. Okay, so just want to introduce our team and your host today. We have Bonnie Holman, the Managing Director of SES Consulting Services, Lauren Enright, the Program Manager of Water Stewardship, and myself, Danielle Stapleton, the Program Manager of ESG Assurance. If you have any questions for us, we're including our contact information here, so please feel free to reach out anytime. Okay, so like I said, this is a joint effort between both branches of SES that includes consulting and global services. They are both each a legally distinct entity that serve different functions. SES Global Services brings over 40 years of sustainability standards, certification, verification, and auditing. And alongside us today is SES Consulting, which is focused on sustainability advisory and implementation. Here at SES, we have science as our foundation, so we're all well equipped to support your full financial journey from start to finish with an expert along every step of the way. Okay, so this is just a little bit about our reach. We're active all over the world and operate in every major industry. SES Consulting has offices operating out of the US and Europe with global representation across the SES network and a range of industry expertise. Okay, like I said, SES is expansive. We are headquartered in California, but have a global presence through multiple offices worldwide. And we operate both remote and on-site as needed to offer some flexibility. And with that, I'm going to introduce our water expert, Lauren, so we can dive in.
Thanks so much, Danielle. Jumping in today, our agenda is going to start by setting the global stage for water, followed by an overview of water stewardship frameworks, and then we'll be plunging into the SES blueprint forward, from strategy to implementation and reporting to assurance. Before we begin, we'll take a quick poll on the question of, is your organization tracking and measuring water metrics? Please select all that are relevant and apply to your practice and/or organization. Starting with no strategy yet, we are just starting our journey in mapping water metrics. We've mapped our water metrics and set goals. We report basic metrics and could expand reporting, or we are seeking third-party assurance. We'll take about another 30 seconds. Perfect. Thank you so much. So we'll set the stage by looking at water in connection to climate instability, investor pressure, and corporate sustainability. Our climate system is under pressure, not just from CO2, but from super pollutants like methane, HFCs, black carbon, and nitrous oxide. We are all aware that these potent gases accelerate warming and are disrupting the global water cycle, driving risks like drought, floods, and water scarcity, which now are urgent threats to business continuity. Generalized climate and water models are falling short, lacking the precision needed for an effective and localized risk response. We see these water stress effects as hotspots around the world. From the Middle East and North Africa, withdrawal over 80% of renewable water annually, making them the most water-stressed countries globally, with India and Pakistan having high populations and extensive agricultural demands, driving extreme water stress. in parts of Australia and southwestern United States, and California, where I'm based, Arizona, and Colorado are facing over-extraction of both surface and groundwater, making these regions highly vulnerable. Water quality hotspots mainly stem from contamination of agriculture, industry, and urbanization. Western United States looks at hotspots such as agricultural runoff, drought and low flow of salinity, groundwater contamination, and PFAS, where the Great Lakes region stems from the decades of heavy industry leaving toxic contaminants, overflow of untreated sewage, and runoff from agriculture, to India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh having high nitrates from sewage and farming, to name just a few. I'll pass it back to my colleague, Danielle.
Thank you, Lauren. So, water is a key factor in how investors and stakeholders are evaluating the risks and opportunities, and it's how they're making their informed decisions. So, it's both a necessary and valuable resource, but it's also an operational risk. Droughts, floods, sea level rise, all of these are the effects that we feel, the effects of climate change that we feel through water. It's the medium in which we most immediately experience climate impact. Things like water scarcity, water quality, access, and availability, those are all considered material risks, and investors are watching how companies are managing those. Now more than ever, people expect companies to align with their values, not just by saying it, but with meaningful action. There's increased scrutiny against environmental claims, which means that your data needs to hold up to that scrutiny and be verifiable. Investors, stakeholders, and consumers, they all want to see clear and credible support for sustainability claims, and they're pretty quick to question those that lack that transparency. Water doesn't have its own protocol yet. There's no water version of the GHG protocol, but several existing frameworks are starting to integrate alongside carbon. So mandatory reporting like CSRD has disclosures around water that include some that are more qualitative, but equally complex. ESRS E3, for example, has a disclosure over marine resource policy implementation. The collection for data here would look very different to something like total discharge. Qualitative data is just a more nuanced approach, and support is usually requires a greater time commitment because it's in depth, it's multiple reviews of different records. Those support might be like surveys, interviews, legal documentation, a little bit less straightforward than classic data. In the context of sustainable finance, so something like a sustainably linked bond, lenders will often have specific requirements for both reporting and assurance as part of the terms of disbursement. And the requirements for sustainably linked loans are subject to lender criteria rather than a regulating body. So we don't have a globally recognized water reporting protocol equivalent to GHG for carbon, but this space is evolving quickly, and we should expect significant growth in frameworks and guidance as water risk becomes more urgent for companies, regulators, and consumers. And with that, I will let Bonnie take it away.
Great, thank you, Danielle. And we're going to get into, even though there isn't, like a GHG protocol for water, we are going to get into some really important kind of frameworks and tools in this presentation that kind of serve to fill that space currently. So we're going to talk just a little bit about where water stewardship lies in the corporate sustainability space and really how it's embedded. And as you can see on your screen, I won't read everything, but including identifying and reducing environmental impacts, managing risk, fostering water resource resiliency while driving economic value. And this is really done through those like water efficiency measures and others, that are detailed on the slide. Water stewardship really has the potential to position companies as leaders in addressing global water challenges. Although we also see that water as a key sustainability topic can oftentimes be overlooked, ignored, or deprioritized within the corporate sustainability space. And this is largely due to its perception as a risk rather than an opportunity. We saw this earlier this year with the initial release of the initial CSRD reports, water can sometimes be deprioritized within the corporate sustainability function within an organization, and that really kind of expands out industry wide. And we saw this earlier this year, actually, with the initial release of the first set of the EU's corporate sustainability reporting directive compliant sustainability reports. Those came out just a few months ago. So amongst that initial set of reports, 200 were analyzed, and water as an environmental topic was notably underreported from a data standpoint. So essentially the number of data points within the water module compared to other modules within the set of standards. And really, climate was the most commonly reported within that standard, which makes sense. But compared to other environmental topics such as waste and energy use, etc., water really was deprioritized. Analysis across the 200 reports went further and actually showed water as a blind spot with underrepresentation and some deprioritization within the double materiality results. And so what I mean by double materiality, that's a required process under the EU's new regulatory framework, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And it really is the process that companies are required to take to identify the impact and financial materiality and associated topics that they then will have to report on. So what that means for water is that those results, not showing really the level of materiality that like we know industry-wide, it's well known, it's well evidenced from an impact and a risk data standpoint. What we really saw is across certain companies, certain industries, and certain geographies where, there's a well-known expectation that water would really come up as material. We just saw that deprioritized and somewhat unrepresented or de-represented in the reports. I mentioned this just to emphasize that water stewardship both has a significant opportunity for action in the corporate sustainability space, and yet there are real blind spots to uncover and address. And sometimes that really comes down to it being viewed as a risk. And so sometimes the effort and everything that goes with it, just kind of falls under some other topics such as climate. So now we're going to get into kind of the blueprint that is really the focus of this webinar. And I'm going to hand it over to Lauren to begin to kind of uncover some of those blind spots towards a water stewardship blueprint.
Thanks so much, Bonnie. So as you notice from this slide, SCS looks at enterprises and its sites as inside the fence line. Supply chains are outside the fence line, and beyond the horizon are economic and environmental stability, in addition to the reputation and health of the actual enterprise. We see business needs and risks as integral to building out a robust water stewardship blueprint. Within looking at the SCS Water Stewardship and Resiliency Standard, all the way to creating water positive goals. The SCS Water Stewardship and Resiliency Certification is a site-specific certification. It is based off the ISO 14001 Environmental Management System for relevance of interoperability of a business operations. The Water Stewardship and Resiliency Standard is used as a baseline to measure water metrics and performance, creating contextually relevant targets, whether it be for water consumption, water efficiencies, water positive, or gaining the SCS WSR for an enterprise's highest water stress sites. Continuous monitoring is built in addition to stakeholder engagement to ensure implementation is occurring. We have built the Water Stewardship and Resiliency Certification to be flexible and incorporate indicators to mitigate climate change adaptation, biodiversity management plans, water reuse, nature-based solutions, and community engagement, to name a few. The certification is a 3-year cycle and offers site-specific and on-product claims. Moving on to our newest verification in the water space for corporations is our water positive verification. The water positive verification is a net positive water impact claim, enabling companies to measure and demonstrate and report through the volumetric water benefit accounting and other relevant standards. It is truly the Wild West right now, where verifications are just beginning and projects are occurring in silos. Companies with high water risks in nearly every industry have made commitments to be water positive, providing the opportunity to contribute to enhancing community resilience, protecting vital ecosystems, reduce operational risks, and increase corporate sustainability's reputation. From tech, manufacturing, food and beverage, to hospitality and more, stakeholders are demanding sustainability goals such as regenerative water, watershed water positive goals, and sustainable supply chains. Water positive can be achieved through resource optimization, restoration of water ecosystems, replenishment and recharge activities, and water stewardship initiatives that improve water quality and availability in the watershed it operates. By achieving the independent water positive verification from SCS Global Services, companies can make verified claims surrounding their water conservation, which also can support CDP, ESG, and SBT targets.
On that note, Lauren, I just want to jump in and say that, these certifications, they're a really great way to get yourselves audit ready for your larger report and, just kind of keep your data organized in a way that's traceable.
We can shift things over to you, Bonnie.
Okay, great. Thank you. Great. So now we're going to kind of jump into the water stewardship blueprint and really look at, what we've laid out here is kind of a roadmap. And what we're going to do is really focus on the operationalization of the webinar's theme around, water stewardship, and specifically looking at how to apply some of the standards and frameworks that Lauren touched on within your organization, and really with the aim to manage water as a critical resource with material impacts, high dependency, even financial risk, amongst other considerations. So from a consulting standpoint, what we really aim to do is to support organizations to set up your water strategy for success. And what I mean by success is really a strategy that's practical, that's achievable, that really addresses stakeholder concerns and expectations, including those investors that Danielle mentioned, and one that is really kind of right-sized to your organization and your capabilities. So let's walk through this roadmap. So the first step on here you'll see is like the assessment process. Here we carry out what's called a materiality screening. And this aims to really identify those core impacts, risk and dependencies across your direct operations. It kind of uncovers, the data pools and really starts getting you kind of started on that data system. So really getting you started on that data system that Danielle kind of, talked about, these certifications really helping kind of to take you through that journey all the way to reporting assurance. This would kind of represent the start of that. Identifying metrics, sources, etc. Kind of through that screening process, we're able to kind of hone in on prioritization. But I mentioned that it's a materiality screening. So I just want to make a quick connection here. When I was speaking previously, I mentioned kind of that first set of the 200 CSRD compliant reports and those double materialities really falling short on water. I think that as a practitioner, I think that one of the reasons for that is that the processes that have been taken up to carry out materiality assessments by kind of large scale consulting firms don't really dive into the topics that are really science-based. And that's really what this materiality screening process brings. And Lauren mentioned that many of the models just don't get at the level of granularity required. And what that means is that level of granularity is not meaningful at the corporate level, a site and enterprise level assessment. This process actually, I would say, addresses some of those blind spots that I mentioned. And so that's all to say that if your organization, is looking at carrying out a company-wide double materiality assessment in terms of looking at some of those environmental-based topics, these types of in-depth processes help to kind of flow into those larger assessments. And this one certainly would fill that gap around water. So from the assessment process, we really move to kind of the prioritization process. And here we're really looking at kind of prioritizing sites within an enterprise and setting an initial strategy that is right-sized for your organization. One of the reasons that we kind of start in this way is to ensure that we're able to kind of move through the strategy in a stepwise manner. And in doing so, we really leverage the SES WSR standard. That's the Water Stewardship and Resiliency Standard. And we use that really as a foundation for creating your water baseline and plans and being able to kind of scale that to the enterprise level. And then that can even go beyond to your upstream value chain or supply chain. I mentioned that because there's other programs that can kind of be leveraged in this process. There's the WAVE process, and the Science-Based Target Network process also follows a prioritization step, but as I mentioned, it's a little bit more expansive, and it requires encompassing enterprise level, and it requires encompassing upstream value chain. So what do I mean when I say, using this prioritization to establish a baseline? We identify a reference year, we establish water metrics across sources, and we capture a full water inventory across the identified scope. So Danielle talked a little bit about the GHG protocol, and the comparative there is carrying out a scope 1, 2, and 3 carbon inventory. Very specific to water, the approach that's taken in this space is an inventory, and it really is just adjusted by scope, and the baseline will really provide that reference data at the correct scope that is going to inform goal setting, implementation, reporting, supporting obviously the certification and the verification processes. One thing to note about kind of the prioritization and the baselining process, it really is kind of commensurate to the size of your organization. So if you're a smaller organization, you only have a few sites, that's going to be a pretty quick process. If you're a pretty complex and large organization, perhaps you've got entities across multiple countries, perhaps you've got a large number of sites, this process of prioritization and baselining can seem very daunting. And so this is where it's going to be a little bit more complex. So as we move from kind of baselining to setting strategy towards reductions and goals, and really getting into understanding, what levers might be accessed to achieve a goal like a 25% water consumption reduction goal, for example, we start to kind of run up against obstacles around feasibility, capability, and responsibility, especially when we see a company kind of trying to take on a goal that's pretty ambitious and also pretty large in scale. And so for this reason, again, we really leverage that WSR standard as a great fit to get started, because it can be applied at the site level and can scale up to the enterprise level. And really by doing so at a kind of a prioritized, smaller set number of sites, you're able to just kind of unlock the ability to test out those levers at the facility or even the field level for agriculture companies, and start to integrate those learnings and understand your meaningful progress and your scaling potential prior to committing, especially publicly committing to really large commitments around reductions. And so essentially we're building off the baseline to create prioritize site-specific implementation plans to meet targets and goals at the site level, and then kind of iterating and expanding forward. And then that process is really the process that falls into that certification and verification process that Lauren talked about. And I just want to mention really quickly here that those certifications kind of allow companies to not only kind of leverage the requirements and the management system practices that are embedded in the standard itself, but the audit and certification gives companies those claims and the ability to have even an on-product logo and make really site and product specific claims and do so in a third-party verified manner. So we have another poll for you, and thank you so much for participating. We're going to give about 45 seconds for this poll, and the question is really around the challenges that your organization may be facing around a water strategy. For this poll, you're going to also select all of the options that apply to you. And those include, maybe you don't have a water expert internally. It's pretty common that that's not the case. Perhaps there's some challenges around data. So we talked a little bit about getting these data systems set up. There's different standards and different frameworks allow for the use of secondary data in certain contexts. And so sometimes it's just a matter of understanding, what type of data you need. Maybe there's some uncertainty around a water goal. There's been a number of water goals that have been communicated publicly that have kind of landed with a little bit of confusion around how a company might be executing on them. Or maybe there's, just some internal challenges around goal setting. It looks like we've got about 40% of the folks responding. So I'll just give about 10 more seconds for folks to respond, and then we can look at the results. Yeah, so the other two options here, sometimes water, if it is seen as a risk, leadership can be hesitant to really approve strategy or even approve the strategy setting process. And sometimes that approval is really a financial constraint. So budget setting for investing in strategy or even the measures to get towards reductions. Great, we can go ahead and end the poll. So now we're going to shift a little bit into kind of that reporting phase and talk a little bit about the global reporting landscape. It is ever evolving and now really comprises a mix of both regulatory and voluntary standards and frameworks and a large number of ranker and rating organizations whom essentially are consuming that data. Excuse me, I'm just going to take a drink of water here. So the landscape really includes a large number of ranker and rating organizations that essentially are consuming the data that's kind of reported out in reference to these standards. And they're doing that for the purposes of helping shareholders, financial institutions, investors with the provision of decision useful data on a company's performance, management of risks, and doing so across common metrics. The common water topics that you see are really just kind of a high level list and largely taken from the GRI standard, which is the largest voluntary standard. And so the GRI 303 water and effluents standard specifically really provides a great kind of common framework in the voluntary space for understanding what you're going to be asked to report on with regard to water. There's a really great interoperability connection between GRI and a number of other standards in the space. But when we are looking, just as by way of example at the water metrics, those are going to be reported out by source, and those are also going to be broken down by water stress areas, just to give you an example of how it works. So you're going to report out on surface water, groundwater, seawater, produced water, and third-party water. And then the management topics include, data points that are going to be both qualitative and quantitative. And there's also, quite a bit of interoperability with some of the other standards that you kind of see on the screen, and we're going to get into a little bit on this next slide. So on this slide, we're really kind of taking you through this blueprint from reporting all the way to reporting assurance. And you can see there's a large number of reporting frameworks here. I just want to quickly go back to Europe's, the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, the ESRS. Danielle mentioned E3 is the water module that also includes marine resources. Really, even if you are not going to fall under CSRD. There's a lot of questions about the scope of companies that might end up falling under that regulation. So if your company is fallen out of that requirement or never fell into it in the first place, I just want to flag that ESRS is a really comprehensive water standard that can be looked at even from a voluntary perspective, and certainly if you're in a competitive space. I-FIRST that you see on here, that is the sustainability disclosure standard under the International Sustainability Standards Board. And it's somewhat new, and it was really created to sit alongside the International Accounting Standard and really support integrated reporting in support of public markets, and to do so by offering a really common kind of global framework that different countries can build national standards off of, but also that can be looked at from a comparative standpoint for public companies. It is not something that only needs to be used by public companies, but to date there are two standards, the S1, which is the general standard, and the S2, which is the climate risk reporting standard. There's talk of other standards being developed, but I'll just say that water fits under S1, the general standard, as a key environmental topic. And then under S2, it's really going to come in around kind of that intersection of water and climate risk that was touched on earlier, droughts, water cycle pressure, and how that's really going to be impacting businesses, both from a physical risk standpoint and a transition risk standpoint. The transition risk standpoint is something that's very interesting, and the process requires kind of looking forward at climate scenarios. So it really is a great exercise for companies to understand some modeled changes over time and what that might mean over a medium and long-term period. I just want to mention that ISSB has additionally assumed the SASB standards. There's 77 industry-specific standards, and many of which contain water reporting requirements. And additionally, the SASB standards, although they're industry-specific, those data systems are really helpful to be kind of leveraged from the processes that we talked about previously. TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Based Financial Disclosures, it's really formed off of the basis of TCFD, which is around climate, and it's really intended to follow that kind of climate risk framework and focus on biodiversity and ecosystem dependencies. And it really strongly focuses on those financial risk and opportunities. So you might be connecting the dots there that TNFD, has some relation to the I-FIRST S2 standard, just in terms of kind of the processes, the risk assessment, strategy setting, and those sorts of things. And for voluntary reporting, I want to end by mentioning CDP. So CDP previously had a standalone water questionnaire. Last year, CDP integrated their topic modules, climate, forest, and water, into an integrated questionnaire. And so what that means is that now companies will report out on water under a water security module. And many of the kind of risk and impact topics they're going to report on in an integrated manner. What we're seeing with CDP is that large companies are requesting their suppliers to report out to CDP, and the changes that CDP has made this last year means that certain sectors and industry classifications are including a requirement to report out on water. So companies are kind of getting into the CDP reporting season, which just opened in the last couple of weeks, and they're surprised to see that now suddenly they need to report on water and they weren't planning on it. So if that's where you're at, or if you haven't gotten into the system but you're planning on reporting out to CDP and don't know if you are going to be required to report out on water, please reach out to us. We can look into that for you, and of course can help you along the way in that report out. And a big part of CDP in terms of like how you score and what your performance looks like is the verification process. So the water inventory verification, really falls into that kind of reporting assurance kind of space, and it is also something that that companies reporting to CDP are needing to get done before the September deadline. And talking about verification and assurance, that is your wheelhouse, Danielle. So I'm going to pass it over to you to kind of take us through the rest of the slide.
Sure. Thank you, Bonnie. So just going through some of our reporting assurance standards that we use. We are ISO accredited under 14064, AA 1000, and ISAE 3000. One of the big questions we get from people who are new to assurance or want to get assured for the first time is when to engage. And one of the biggest things I will tell people is to engage very early. Part of the process is, there's a back and forth with assurance where we would give findings and require corrections. So getting involved early, even if it's just to kind of understand the process, is very vital. It's something we always recommend to people. And with water assurance, for the most part, that might be new to people. So there's going to be a learning curve, and it is important to kind of consider that in order to meet your deadlines. Okay, so how does your company currently report on water? So I'm just going to give you a minute here. I'm sure everyone's at different places in their journey. Some of you might just be starting out, early stages of even identifying what data you can report on. And that's a great place to begin. Everyone has to start there. Some of you might be already doing the CDP water, like Bonnie mentioned, and that's great. That's a strong, signal of transparency and commitment to your goals. I know we did talk about CSRD, so some of you might have started the ESRS or fallen out of scope with the ESRS, or maybe you're continuing. And then maybe some of you haven't thought about water until this call today, and that's okay too. This space is moving quickly, so it's a great opportunity right now to start building out your water data, your water reporting, before some of these other requirements start moving and becoming mandatory. So it looks like it's a pretty fair split. Not started reporting. A lot of you are doing CDP. That's great. I don't know if those results shared to everybody, but the second one did. Them. You did. Okay, great. Okay, so I want to just take a second to zoom out really quick. ESG assurance is, in the broad sense, it's reporting your sustainability reporting, so that includes your environmental, your social, and your governance metrics across your entire organization. When we write sustainability reports, we're looking for a broad range of topics that paints a picture of your commitments to best practice. Water falls under that umbrella and rolls up into the overall report. But just being a piece of a sustainability report does not mean that it is an easy task to accomplish. So measuring and monitoring your water use is necessary, but reporting and verifying really elevates your sustainability reporting. It's just something that establishes your organization as one that's leading the way for improved disclosure. Earlier, we mentioned the term water's new carbon. And I want to just circle back to that really quick, because if we look back a decade ago, carbon emissions were the focal point of environmental reporting. Companies that started doing this first were really leading the way in sustainability. They were, gaining trust. They really owned their regulatory readiness, and they earned their investor confidence. Today, we're seeing a similar movement. It's just water this time. So it's a critical metric in ESG reporting because basically the entire value chain relies on it. Water is in the spotlight now because of growing scarcity, uneven distribution, but also because it's vital in both ecosystems and business operations. Anything from agriculture to manufacturing, nearly every sector is reliable on access to clean water. And considering that water data collection might be new to a lot of people, just getting that information verified is going to ensure that you're not taking any missteps, but also it's a great way to improve. As you get findings, you're going to naturally get better at the process year over year, and your internal process is going to be improved as you make corrections. So just as a definition, assurance is a broad enterprise-wide approach. You can think of it as an evaluation that looks at the reliability of information, process, and controls across your whole organization. But it's not just about checking those numbers. It's about understanding how that information is generated, what the systems that store it are, and whether they're complete and can be considered trustworthy. Assurance is typically integrated into governance and risk management frameworks and supports continuous improvement, as I said, year over year. As you progress through the assurance process and address findings, your internal systems and processes will naturally improve. So over time, you're going to get stronger and more reliable data and have increased confidence in your reporting. This is really beneficial for organizations that are doing more than one framework. It promotes consistency and enhances the credibility of disclosures across requirements. When you're compiling data across multiple frameworks, it can be really overwhelming and confusing. And there are different, regulations that you want to meet. Going with assurance can make sure that you're ticking the right boxes in the right places, and this way you have a clear process to follow and nothing is slipping through the cracks. Your data is coming through complete, accurate, and supported. Part of assurance also is protection against liability. So misrepresenting your data can lead to fines and legal ramifications. Doing your due diligence and ensuring that it's correctly represented protects your organization from legal action, loss of confidence in stakeholders, and protects against greenwashing. And most importantly, allows your work to stand up to scrutiny. And when we talk about expectations for something like insurance, ESG and water assurance, these are not one-size-fits-all engagements. So we will tailor the work to create the needs, to work with your needs and create like a bespoke report for you. ESG, just in its nature, is very varied. So we will tailor an approach that's going to work best for you because there's no two alike. And aligning expectations on what assurance can meaningfully deliver to you is important. So having conversations, again, really early, especially if you're reporting on things that are qualitative, where there's multiple layers of analysis involved. Okay, so going through the process and regulations, the voluntary world, mandatory world, it's a lot going on. At the end of the day, how does it benefit you? What's the benefit for you? Number one being the reliability. So ensuring the integrity of your reporting. Third party plays a critical role here. Independent providers will validate the data, minimize errors, misstatements, and again, remove greenwashing, and just adds a layer of credibility that internal review can't provide for you. So there's so many different ESG regulations globally, like what is required in the EU might not be required in the US or Asia. So this way you have a tailored strategy that's going to ensure that you're in line with each jurisdiction, and obtaining assurance of the data is going to make sure that your report is coming through as strongly as possible. Second, your stakeholder value. Like I mentioned earlier, these are values that stakeholders hold right now. So when you're getting it assured, you're signaling to them, your investors, your consumers, and your regulators that your company is serious about transparency and accountability, and that you're backed by evidence, not just marketing. In a related bullet, trust in your brand. Like I said, people care about where they shop. People care about who they work for. They support brands that align with their beliefs. So prioritizing sustainability is going to paint you as progressive, responsible, and worthy of long-term loyalty. Last but not least, compliance. So complying with environmental, financial, and data privacy regulations is essential. The CSRD fines are quite high, so it's very important to make sure that you're collecting the correct data and reporting it correctly. You might be facing fines, sanctions, or even operational disruptions if you're not in compliance, especially as investors are increasingly demanding alignment with ESG frameworks.
Thank you so much, Danielle. So as we wrap up, we really want to come back to this concept of, a water stewardship blueprint and really achieving, your goals and creating a strategy that you can execute on. And we talked a lot about different standards and frameworks and, how those can be applied. And, when you're doing that work, you have partners to kind of take you along the way. So this is really just kind of breaking down for you, how we support our clients in a comprehensive way and really serve as your partner along every step of the way. So, it does start off with us on the consulting side, the doers and the helpers. And so we're really there to help with the, assessment, prioritization, baselining process. really setting that strategy with clear water implementation plans at the level of scale that is commensurate with what you're able to and willing to and want to take on. And that includes the target setting process and can go on to kind of implementation. And then I'm going to skip really quickly the verification space, and we can come back to that. But we really also take that connection, that work, and leverage it into reporting preparation. So, that data preparation that kind of Danielle mentioned, being really critical around the reporting assurance step. We don't do the assurance work, but we sure do the pre-assurance work with our clients, making sure that their data is assurance ready. And because we have such a strong background in this space of auditing and verification from an institutional standpoint, we're really well positioned to support clients, particularly in water, to really kind of take that strategy from that start to finish place on the consulting side. Before we go to questions, Lauren, did you want to kind of wrap us up on the partnerships around verification?
Sure. So I guess one point I missed is, in terms of even looking beyond your own fence line and looking at water positive verifications, we already have 3 project developers that have asked for verification of their projects. So it's definitely underway as far as where that action and momentum is going. I'd like to answer probably one of the questions in tandem with something that I think about on the daily is, yes, we've created a site-specific standard, but we don't stop there. We're looking at what is beyond that. So the ethical supply chains is definitely and has been on my mind for a number of years. And so what does that look like if we see the site-specific standard as a scope 1, and being able to leverage and expand that, as sort of we were discussing over the last hour, in a scope 2, in a scope 3. And that scope 3 is going to start looking at your supply chain with water. So, we have been asked by corporates, by NGOs, in terms of where does it go from here? And essentially, you're not just stopping at, creating a water positive verification, because essentially those are right now are super siloed projects that we want to be able to hone in on. And that's a super exciting sort of piece that we have a lot of momentum from right now.
That's great. Thank you, Lauren. I know we do have a few questions here, and I just want to do a quick time check for the audience. We've got about 5 minutes remaining on the official webinar time, and so I think we do want to give a little bit of space. If you do have a question and you have not entered it yet, please do. There's the 3 of us to answer, and we've got an organizer panel that's kind of reviewing these questions, and so we've got a few minutes to take a few if there are any remaining. Any pending that haven't been submitted yet?
So I'll jump in, Bonnie, and answer this one about the Alliance for Water Stewardship. SCS was a certification body to the Alliance for Water Stewardship for a number of years. We are no longer a certification body, and we were asked a number of years ago to actually create a second option in addition to what is going on in the water stewardship space. So just as far as sort of the expansiveness of where we're sort of seeing corporates ask and auditors even ask for different indicators and different rigor, that's essentially sort of where we've landed. We're definitely in talks with a number of different NGOs across the board in just terms of coming together in a more egalitarian way to be able to jump off into water stewardship initiatives.
Yeah, and maybe just to dovetail on that, I do remember when AWS took that, what was that third-party certification kind of internal, from kind of that road mapping standpoint, in terms of if you're a company that is familiar with AWS or using AWS, we talked a little bit about stair stepping, your process from a prioritization standpoint to an enterprise standpoint. And so, given AWS's focus around enterprise, that's something that certainly could be leveraged into kind of the consulting support, particularly if AWS is something that you are already familiar with or already starting to implement and have questions around, or maybe you don't know how it connects to kind of the reporting standards. So yeah, so there's an intersection there on a couple of different levels.
Danielle, I'm noticing one about what level of assurance is recommended for water data.
Yeah, so I mean, that's really up to you. Typically, people would start at something like a limited assurance, especially in the water space with it being new. But the question of what level of assurance you want to do, that's an internal decision for you to make. I think in general, the process starts out with limited, moving into reasonable, which reflects also some of the mandatory requirements for assurance. Also start out as limited and then progress into reasonable assurance. With the difference being, the in-depth review of reasonable, examining your controls. So it is typically recommended that you start at limited if you're a first-time assurer.
Great. And I see one here, Lauren. I'm going to actually ping this one over to you. It's really specific around the water positive verification. And it's asking, is there a water positive verification at the site level or the corporate level? And then additionally, does water positive verification also consider site wastewater and stormwater?
Yes, I got a similar one around if a company extracts water from location A and supports water restoration projects in location B that's far away, can it claim to be water positive? The result is still a burden on an aquifer at location A. And I would say to answer that question just in specific, because I'm trying to find your other question, Bonnie, the water positive verification claim is local to where water was extracted, likely in a water stressed region or watershed or specific ecosystem. As far as, was it a site specific question? Because I'd be happy to answer that. Let me see.
Yes, it is asking, is the verification at the site or the corporate level?
So typically that would happen at the site level. An enterprise-wide goal is likely made, and you're seeing them across the board right now, likely for more tech companies. But those tech companies really zero in, as Bonnie mentioned, to those prioritized sites and wondering what different water stewardship activities in terms of restoration or replenishment or whether it's in the ag space or reuse space or ecosystem space can work. And I'd be happy to, I have everyone's email, so I'd happy to follow up with more specifics, just as far as like methodology and the way we're looking at the impacts concerned locally.
Let's see. I'm just noting the time here, and we are at time. There are just a few additional questions here. I see one, from an organization that's been collecting water footprint data, and so it sounds like you've got some water data, and you're looking for next steps on what to do. There's a couple of different things that you can do. It looks like your data collection process is like kind of getting towards what you need to do some baselining. There were those other steps that we kind of talked about, the assessment prioritization steps. My question for you is like, is that data that you've started to collect, is that comprehensive? So I think, probably a quick check on assessment. Let's look at how large you are. It looks like you've got leased offices and maybe are not that large. There's a number of things that you could do, with the efforts that you've started. You're certainly like starting that pathway towards being able to look at feasibility around target setting, and we'd love to talk to you about that. There's
I see a few more questions.
here. I
Oh,
think
go
I'm
ahead,
going to
Dawn.
reach out to this person, but it's just asking if there's a standardized methodology for quantifying benefits. Benefits is such a broad term. And so if you're looking at this from like an ecosystem benefit perspective, would be really interested to understand that. And and so I think maybe this one just deserves kind of a follow up. There's certainly measurable
Yes.
benefits from a replenishment standpoint that it's just a little broad.
Yeah, I was going to answer that one. The co-benefits are either, of volumetric benefits. They're going to be
Mhm.
ecosystem benefits, community co-benefits, and actually what we're seeing is a lot of the corporates want to help out the community as far as the narrative is concerned in connection with ecosystems. So I'll happily follow up with that one as well, Bonnie, with
Perfect.
you. I think we're at time, but we're there's more than enough questions to keep going.
I
Yeah, absolutely. And our emails are here, so please do reach out. We will be sending out the recording of the webinar to the registrants and participants. And thank you to the 80 of you that are still on the call at the end. That's actually a really high number and really underscores the importance of water as a conversation in this space. So really appreciate your participation. We're here to answer your questions and kind of help you to execute on that water stewardship blueprint. And yeah, thank you so much. And also to Danielle and Lauren, this was really fun to do this webinar with you both. So thanks for letting consulting join in. And yeah, looking forward to what comes next. I love the hearts
Thanks so
and
much,
the
all.
applause from the audience. Thank you. We really
It,
appreciate that.
I love the love. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.